Hey everybody, welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show, and this is your Daily Drop. Today is October 12th, and this will be the Daily Drop number 10, and boy do we have a doozy today. We're going to talk a little bit about Mr. Bill Gates, another man who didn't know anything, a guy who knew nothing about what Epstein was up to, a guy that obviously had nothing to do with it, a guy that never in a million years would guess what Jeffrey Epstein was up to. But wait. Even after being convicted of what Epstein was convicted of, Bill Gates spent time with Jeffrey Epstein. Once again, why? Why would somebody like Bill Gates, who has all the power and all the influence in the world, have to hang out with a man such as Jeffrey Epstein? What draw does Jeffrey Epstein have to draw these people into his life? What did he have over them? What did he have to offer them? These are the questions that are not being answered. Well, as you all know who have been on this journey with us from the beginning, I'm pretty critical of the legacy media. In this instance, I'm going to give them some credit because the New York Times does a really great job with this piece about Bill Gates that we're going to get into here in a second. And it's what they should be doing, as opposed to the junk journalism that you see, the clickbait journalism, where they look to divide and confuse the public as opposed to inform them, which is their job. This article is pretty in-depth. It goes into some details, and this is what we need more of. We need more high-profile media outlets hitting the ground and doing the actual work that they should be doing for the citizens of the country. That's their job. They're the buffer between us and the powers that be. And if the media doesn't go about their business in an unbiased manner, well, it's not good for anybody, and it's certainly not good for their credibility. Anyway, so we're going to jump into this article. And like I said, it's by the New York Times. I'll link it in the description like usual so you guys can go and check it out yourselves. And we'll see where it goes. Bill Gates met with Jeffrey Epstein many times despite his past. So that's the headline. Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender who committed suicide in prison, managed to lure an astonishing array of rich, powerful, and famous men into his orbit. There were billionaires Leslie Wexner and Leon Black, politicians Bill Clinton and Bill Richardson, Nobel laureates Murray Gell-Mann and Frank Wilczek, and even royals Prince Andrew. Few, though, compared in prestige and power to the world's second richest person, a brilliant and intensely private luminary, Bill Gates. And unlike many others, Mr. Gates started the relationship after Mr. Epstein was convicted of sex crimes. All right, so Bill Gates started the relationship after the fact even. So it wasn't like they had an established relationship beforehand. It was after the fact, when it was on record and everybody knew what Epstein was. Bill Gates decided, hey, this is the man that I'm going to hang out with this guy, and we're going to maybe get into some business together. At the very least, I'm going to see what he has to say. Why would Bill Gates, the second richest man in the world, need Epstein? It makes zero sense. All right. Mr. Gates, the Microsoft co-founder, whose $100 billion plus fortune has endowed the world's largest charitable organization, has done his best to minimize his connections to Mr. Epstein. I didn't have any business relationship or friendship with him, he told the Wall Street Journal last month. Obviously, that was a lie. In fact, beginning in 2011, Mr. Gates met with Mr. Epstein on numerous occasions, including at least 3 times at Mr. Epstein's palatial Manhattan townhouse that Wexner gave him, and at least once staying late into the night, according to interviews with more than a dozen people familiar with the relationship, as well as documents reviewed by the New York Times. Employees of Mr. Gates' foundation also paid multiple visits to Mr. Epstein's mansion, and Mr. Epstein spoke with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and J.P. Morgan Chase about a proposed multi-billion-dollar charitable fund, an arrangement that he had potential to generate enormous fees for Mr. Epstein. Okay. Again, there's questions that need to be answered. Why is Bill Gates trying to get into business with Jeffrey Epstein? What does Bill Gates have to gain from any of this? His lifestyle is very different and kind of intriguing. Although it would not work for me, Mr. Gates emailed colleagues in 2011 after his first get-together with Mr. Epstein. What does that even mean? His lifestyle is very different? Well, yeah, he's a pedophile. So I'm guessing his lifestyle is a little bit different than yours, unless, of course, you guys are fellow travelers. You know, I'm not accusing Mr. Gates of anything, but, questions need to be asked, and, we expect answers. Bridget Arnold, the spokeswoman for Mr. Gates, said he was referring only to the unique decor of the Epstein residence and Epstein's habit of spontaneously bringing acquaintances in to meet Mr. Gates. The decor? Maybe Bill Gates should hire the same spin doctor that Prince Andrew hired, because he's obviously going to need it. That's a horrible excuse. That's as bad as I didn't know anything, that I didn't see anything, that I wasn't involved. It was no way meant to convey a sense of interest or approval, she said. Over and over, Mr. Epstein managed to cultivate close relationships with some of the world's most powerful men. He lured them with the whiff of money and the proximity to other powerful, famous, or wealthy people, so much so that many looked past his reputation for sexual misconduct. And the more people he drew into his circle, the easier it was for him to attract others. Mr. Gates and the $51 billion Gates Foundation have championed the well-being of young girls. All right, pause. Again, it's another thing we see with most of these high-profile sex trafficking rings. They use their money to gain access, and then once that access is gained, they begin the grooming process. By the time Mr. Gates and Mr. Epstein first met, Mr. Epstein had served jail time for soliciting prostitution from a minor and was required to register as a sex offender. So he was a sex offender, a registered sex offender, and Bill Gates was still hanging out with him. Let's just be clear about all of this. Miss Arnold said that high-profile people had introduced Mr. Gates and Mr. Epstein and that they had met multiple times to discuss philanthropy. Bill Gates regrets ever meeting with Epstein and recognizes it was an error in judgment to do so, Miss Arnold said. Gates recognizes that entertaining Epstein's ideas related to philanthropy gave Epstein an undeserved platform that was at odds with Gates' personal values and the values of his foundation. An error in judgment? The man was on a list. He was a registered sex offender. He was on a list of people that shouldn't be around children. Everybody knew this. It was public information. You're the second richest man in the world. And here you are spending time with him. Why? Why? The first meeting. Two members of Mr. Gates' inner circle, Boris Nikolic and Melanie Walker, were close to Mr. Epstein and at times functioned as intermediaries between the two men. Miss Walker met Mr. Epstein in 1992, 6 months after graduating from the University of Texas. Mr. Epstein, who was an advisor to Mr. Wexner, shocking, huh? The owner of Victoria's Secret told Miss Walker that he could land her an audition for a modeling job there, according to Miss Walker. She later moved to New York and stayed in a Manhattan apartment building that Mr. Epstein owned. After she graduated from medical school, she said, Mr. Epstein hired her as a science advisor in 1998. Miss Walker later met Steven Sinofsky, a senior executive at Microsoft who became president of its Windows division, and moved to Seattle to be with him. In 2006, she joined the Gates Foundation with title of Senior Program Officer. At the foundation, Miss Walker met and befriended Mr. Nikolic, a native of what is now Croatia and a former fellow at Harvard Medical School, who was the foundation's science advisor. Mr. Nikolic and Mr. Gates frequently traveled and socialized together. Miss Walker, who had remained in close touch with Mr. Epstein, introduced him to Mr. Nikolic and the men became friendly. Mr. Epstein and Mr. Gates first met face-to-face on the evening of January 31st, 2011 at Mr. Epstein's townhouse on the Upper East Side. They were joined by Dr. Eva Anderson Dubin, a former Miss Sweden whom Mr. Epstein had once dated, and her 15-year-old daughter. Dr. Anderson Dubin's husband, the hedge fund billionaire Glenn Dubin, was a friend and business associate of Mr. Epstein. The Dubins declined to comment. Yeah, I know, they knew nothing as well. The gathering started at 8 and lasted several hours, according to Miss Arnold. Mr. Gates' spokeswoman. Mr. Epstein subsequently boasted about the meeting in emails to friends and associates. "Bill's great," he wrote in one reviewed by the Times. Mr. Gates, in turn, praised Mr. Epstein's charm and intelligence, emailing colleagues the next day, and he said, "A very attractive Swedish woman and her daughter dropped by, and I ended up staying there quite late." Okay. What? I don't even understand any of that. Why would he email colleagues and say that some very nice Swedish lady showed up, so he stayed late? None of this stuff makes sense. Mr. Gates soon saw Mr. Epstein again. At a TED conference in Long Beach, California, and attendees spotted the two men engaged in private conversation. Ho, to be a roach in the rushes. Later that spring, on May 3rd, 2011, Mr. Gates again visited Mr. Epstein at his New York mansion, according to emails about the meeting and a photograph reviewed by the Times. The photo taken in Mr. Epstein's marble-clad entrance hall shows a beaming Mr. Epstein in blue and gold slippers and a fleece decorated with an American flag, flanked by luminaries. On his right, James E. Staley, at the time a senior J.P. Morgan executive, and former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers. On his left, Mr. Nikolic and Mr. Gates smiling and wearing gray slacks and a navy sweater. A vast charitable fund. Around that time, the Gates Foundation and J.P. Morgan were teaming up to create the Global Health Investment Fund. Its goal was to provide individual and institutional investors the opportunity to finance late-stage global health technologies that have the potential to save millions of lives in low-income countries. As the details of the fund were being hammered out, Mr. Staley told his J.P. Morgan colleagues that Mr. Epstein wanted to be brought into the discussions, according to two people familiar with the talks. Mr. Epstein was an important J.P. Morgan customer, holding millions of dollars in accounts at the bank and referring a procession of wealthy individuals to become clients of the company. Okay, so we're going to pause the article there real quick, and we're going to talk about the RICO that I like to discuss when we're talking about possible ways they could go after people in this case. If they use the RICO laws, all of these people that were involved with Epstein, especially if it's involved with money transferring, can seriously be exposed in this case. So you have to ask yourself, and you have to wonder, if RICO is not used, then why? Who are they trying to protect again? And really the question will be, are we going to let them get away with it? All right, back to the article. Mr. Epstein pitched an idea for a separate charitable fund to J.P. Morgan officials, including Mr. Staley, and to Mr. Gates' advisor, Mr. Nikolic. He envisioned a vast fund seeded with the Gates Foundation money that would focus on health projects around the world, according to 5 people involved in or briefed on the talks, including current and former Gates Foundation and J.P. Morgan employees. In addition to the Gates money, Mr. Epstein planned to round up donations from his wealthy friends and hopefully from J.P. Morgan's richest clients. Mr. Epstein thought he could personally benefit. I bet in more ways than one. I'm guessing it's not just money. He circulated a 4-page proposal that included a suggestion that he be paid 0.3% of whatever money he raised, according to one person who saw the proposal. If Mr. Epstein had raised $10 billion, for example, that would have amounted to $30 million in fees. Miss Arnold and Mr. Gates and the foundation had been unaware that Mr. Epstein had been seeking any fee. She said Mr. Epstein did propose to Bill Gates and then foundation officials ideas that he promised would unleash hundreds of billions for global health-related work. Once again, it's all about charities, it's all about helping people, and none of it has to do with gaining access. In late 2011, at Mr. Gates' instruction, the foundation sent a team to Mr. Epstein's townhouse to have a preliminary talk about fundraising, according to 3 people who were there. Mr. Epstein told his guests that if they searched his name on the internet, they might conclude he was a bad person, but that what he had done, soliciting prostitution from an underage girl, was no worse than stealing a bagel, 2 of the people said. All right. Hold on. Slam them brakes, boys and girls. Stealing a bagel? Look, not only was this man sick in his actions, this man was obviously very, very, very sick in his thoughts. And the world is obvious. Do not misunderstand me. The world is obviously a much better place without him in it. The only reason that I would want this foul human being, and I use that word loosely when describing him, to be around is to answer for his crimes and to point fingers at people who were involved. Some of the Gates Foundation employees said they had been unaware of Mr. Epstein's criminal record and had been shocked to learn that the foundation was working with a sex offender. They worried that it could seriously damage the foundation's reputation. Yeah, you think? You're hanging out with a convicted sex offender and you're trying to get funding from him for whatever reason, who knows why. In early 2012, another Gates Foundation team met Mr. Epstein at his mansion. He claimed they had access to trillions of dollars of his clients' money that he could put in proposed charitable fund, a figure so preposterous that it left his visitors doubting Mr. Epstein's credibility. Flying to Florida. Mr. Gates and Mr. Epstein kept seeing each other. Miss Arnold will not say how many times the two had met. In March 2013, Mr. Gates flew on Mr. Epstein's Gulfstream plane from Teterboro Airport. Remember, Teterboro, we've talked about that a lot. That's where a lot of these flights originated to that island as well. In New Jersey to Palm Beach, Florida, according to a flight manifest. Miss Arnold said Mr. Gates, who has his own $40 million jet, hadn't been aware it was Mr. Epstein's plane. Oh, BS. What a bunch of bullocks. He wasn't aware that it was Mr. Epstein's plane. The second richest man in the world has no idea. He doesn't have a security detail. He doesn't have a whole group of people that are making sure that he's not associating with people like this. If Mr. Gates was associating with Epstein, and he was doing it of his own free will. Nobody was forcing him. He had nobody telling him he had to do it. He did it because he wanted to and he thought he could gain one way or the other. 6 months later, Mr. Nikolic and Mr. Gates were in New York for a meeting related to Schrodinger, a pharmaceutical software company in which Mr. Gates had a large investment. On that trip, Mr. Epstein and Mr. Gates met for dinner and discussed the Gates Foundation, and Miss Arnold said, in October 2014, Mr. Gates donated $2 million to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Media Lab. University officials described the gift in internal emails as having been directed by Mr. Epstein. Miss Arnold said there was no intention nor explicit ask for the funding to be controlled in any manner by Epstein, which is blatantly a lie, pretty much. We all know how involved Epstein was with MIT and Harvard and the rest of these institutions, and we all know that he had most of these academics under his thumb. Why? What were they doing on these islands? Has anybody asked that? So far, they're just scratching the surface with these academics. So far, it's just about where the money was, what they were involved in inside of these institutes for research. Nobody has asked what these men were doing on this island, with these young girls. Soon after, the relationship between Mr. Epstein and Mr. Gates appears to have cooled. The charitable fund that had been discussed with the Gates Foundation never materialized. Mr. Epstein complained to an acquaintance at the end of 2014 that Mr. Gates had stopped talking to him, according to a person familiar with the discussion. The relationship, however, wasn't entirely severed. At least two senior Gates Foundation officials maintained contacts with Mr. Epstein until late 2017, according to former foundation employees. Miss Arnold said the foundation was not aware of any such contact over time. Gates and his team realized Epstein's capabilities and ideas were not legitimate, and all contact with Epstein was discontinued, she said. I don't believe that. I don't have any evidence supporting that that's not the case, but I'm sure coming down the line we'll get a report that that wasn't the case, just like the report that Gates didn't really know him. Oh, yes, you did. Days before Mr. Epstein hanged himself, allegedly, in a Manhattan jail cell on August 10th, he amended his will and named Mr. Nikolic as a fallback executor in the event that one of the two primary executors was unable to serve. Mr. Nikolic has declined in court proceedings to serve as an executor. A little too late there, buddy, to distance yourself. We're on to you. We know you were involved in some way, so we're not going to stop reporting on it, and we're going to be following that. Add that name to our list, folks. Mr. Nikolic, who is now running a venture capital firm with Mr. Gates as one of his investors, said he was shocked to be named in Mr. Epstein's will. He said in a statement to the Times, "I deeply regret ever meeting Mr. Epstein." No, I think that's a lie. I think you deeply regret Epstein ever getting caught, and you getting caught up with this. If you deeply regretted meeting Mr. Epstein, pretty sure you would have said something before all of this came out and your name was dragged through the mud. All right? So, That's the article from the New York Times today. That's the big news today in the Epstein case. Pretty much the only thing that dropped. And as you can see, Bill Gates was a lot closer to Jeffrey Epstein than he said he was, just like the rest of these guys and gals are. We know that Wexner was his top guy. We know this. They can try and deflect. They can try and say it's not a fact. That's fine. We're going to keep digging. We're going to keep searching for answers. We're not going to be thrown off the scent. We're not going to chase disinformation here. We're going to follow these stories. We're going to look under every single rock. We're going to chase down every single lead that we can. And we're going to follow this story the way that we want to follow it. We're not going to follow it the way the narrative from the mainstream media sends us. So it's nice when we get a little bit of good work from the New York Times like we got here. And no doubt, I'll give them their kudos and their props because we need more of that. We need all the help we can get. As I've said before, we're an independent group here. It's I don't have nowhere near the funding as someplace like the New York Times does. So everything I do here is organic and using the sources I've cultivated as an independent journalist working on other stories. So as far as the podcast goes, this is all happening in real time. We're learning about all this stuff together on these daily drops. So that's why I think that these are important to do. I think it's important to have something like this as a reference point to help unravel the story. And I'm going to continue to keep doing these because this story just keeps getting, hotter and hotter by the day as these stories trickle out. I also set up a Patreon for the podcast, so I'll drop that link in the description as along with the source. And if you guys would like to donate to the podcast, help us bring even more content to you, that would be great. And if not, it would be awesome for you just to share the content with your friends, just to get the message out there, so that together we can seriously put the pressure on these sick and despicable people who have really gone beyond the line of disgusting behavior. Anyway, I hope everybody's enjoying their weekend. Tomorrow will be the 1 hour long format show. It'll be uploaded for you guys in the afternoon, and we'll tie everything up that we've talked about this week. And if anything new drops, we'll talk about that as well. Look forward to talking to you guys then. Look for a new daily drop on Monday. All right, everybody. Talk to you later.